everyone, Claudia here. Welcome to my little channel. It is fan art time again, but before I get into this in more detail, let me say a few words about my painting and thought process first. This was, as often for me, meant to be a quick painting, but of course I spent forever on it. The reason was probably because I didn't plan ahead much and only had a rough idea of what I wanted the painting to look like in the end. I basically just grabbed a random reference photo from my folder of references that looked interesting and pondered about what to do with it. And my mind somehow went immediately to Shallan from the Stormlight Archives book series by Brandon Sanderson, which is interesting because I have wanted to make a colored-in fan art for ages. But maybe that was the trick that got me started, because I didn't have as many expectations to get the image right that's been living in my mind for a long time. I think this was the first time I used my table easel, and I loved how the paint just runs to the bottom. It makes creating even washes much easier and works even if you just randomly slap paint onto your paper like I did. I'm definitely using this thing more often from this point on. For pattern, that is the pattern that is pattern, I'll explain in a second, I decided to use masking fluid. Mine is quite old and I've heard people say that theirs got unusable after a few weeks, but my stuff worked just fine. Probably because it had sealed itself shut. No really, the lid got glued to the bottle so thoroughly that I had to literally crack it open, hence the different cap. I used a tool that's meant to be used with tracing paper because I didn't feel like sacrificing a brush for this, and I don't have a dedicated brush for masking fluids right now. I don't know if I would recommend this tool because I had to dip into the masking fluid like every 3 seconds. But it was a waste of time anyway, because in the end I hated the pattern I drew and just completely removed it. So if it has disappeared later in the video, that's the reason. Good news is that this old masking fluid was super easy to remove with an eraser, so I was lucky it didn't cause any damage to the paper. Still a waste of time. Although I do think the idea of using masking fluid wasn't that bad, but I couldn't make the lines fine and intricate enough for my liking, and I didn't feel like reworking every edge after removing it. When I had most of the painting done with watercolors, I went in with gouache, mostly with the intention to lighten parts of the hair. The watercolor base actually looked quite nice, but no, I just had to ruin it. Luckily, gouache is fairly easy to lift unless you use acrylic gouache. In that case, the only way to fix your mistake is by adding more paint. So this was literally a case of rinse and repeat. I guess now you know why this little painting took me longer than expected. Memo to me, be better at planning ahead. The end result turned out fine, even though it's not quite what I wanted. I used some colored pencils to refine a few areas, but I did not need them a whole lot, which I consider a good thing. Nothing against heavily using colored pencils, but I personally like to do as much as possible with my watercolors and only use the colored pencils for some final touches. Pattern was done with copper metallic watercolor. I don't think there's any description of his color in the books, as far as I remember, but I think he can change into any color the same way he can change his shape. I didn't film this, but I also used a bit of gold paint and metallic pens for some finer lines. The things that look like snowflakes are supposed to be passion spren. I know that inspiration spren are the best fit for Shallan, but not only was I feeling lazy, I also thought they might look strange and distracting. What is a spren, you might ask now? So, here's a very short review of the Stormlight Archives book series by Brandon Sanderson and his Cosmere universe, because Shallan Davar, who I tried to depict here, is one of the main characters. Let me try to describe the series to you. There might be minor spoilers along the way. So, the story takes place on Rosha, which is mostly made up of one large continent of the same name. Rosha is frequently ravaged by a storm running across the whole continent that is so strong that not only people and animals need to take cover, but also the plants. As good as everything has adapted to that extreme recurring weather phenomenon. Also, the storm itself is an entity called the Stormfather. And then there are the Spren. They appear to be manifestations of natural occurrences and emotions. The actual explanation is quite complex and kind of obscure, but that's what they seem to be at the start of the story. So there are Wind Spren, Fire Spren, Rain Spren, Life Spren, Death Spren, and so on. And I guess Ale and Wine Spren belong to the Nature Spren as well. They all look different and appear whenever their corresponding phenomenon occurs. The same goes for the emotion spren, such as anger, joy, shame, and the passion and inspiration spren I already mentioned with regards to my painting. The story begins with a long ongoing war that started after the king of Alethkar got assassinated. So for a couple of years now, the Alethi forces have made themselves comfortable at the edge of the so-called Shattered Plains, which look like clay soil that dried out in the sun and cracked, but enlarged and with deep chasms between the plateaus. While the Alethi are humans, those they fight are called Pashendi, who are humanoid, with their most obvious difference in appearance being their marbled skin of different combinations of white, black and red. They are able to change their form to suit their current needs, such as maid form, war form, work form, scholar form, etc., which not only changes their appearance, but also their mentality to some extent. Needless to say, some of the Alethi aren't fighting to avenge their killed king anymore, but are only interested in the profits, since the Shattered Plains also provide precious resources. The futility of that war is basically the point, but it also sets things into motion that more or less challenges the order of the world, both on the side of the humans as well as the Pashendi. So who is Shallan and how is she connected to all of this? Shallan is a young woman from a minor noble house, an aspiring scholar, and a very talented artist. Oh, and by the way, nobility is tightly linked to the lightness of your eye color, although at the start of the story no one really remembers why light eyes make you special. Needless to say, this all gets explained over the course of the books, and to no one's surprise, the eye color you are born with doesn't mean anything. The very, very abbreviated reason Shallan gets involved with the war in the first place is because she takes on an apprenticeship with the Alethi princess. And she also gets some interesting abilities along the way. You see, as it turns out, there are also unique spren who can choose humans they want to bond with. A bond with one of those unique spren will grant you special abilities. And Shallan bonds with Pattern, who appears as a constantly shifting geometric pattern. Since Pattern, unlike some other unique spren, cannot turn himself completely invisible, he often blends into her clothes whenever he or Shallan doesn't want him to be seen. Of course, Shallan is not the only one bonding to a unique spren. Those who do are called Knights Radiant and were thought to be the stuff of legends. And they're not the only things from myths and legends that make a return. So the story not only has different species of the world clash with each other, there's also a big bad entity to mess things up further. And here ends my extremely short introduction into the Stormlight Archives book series that was probably quite confusing and skips over every important character save Shallan. But anything beyond that would totally blow up this video, and besides, I have a confession to make. I only started reading the fourth book, Rhythm of War, a couple of days ago, even though I read the others shortly after they came out. And the reason is that I found book 3, Oathbringer, to have quite the pacing issues, and from what I could gather from other people's reviews, these problems also extend to Rhythm of War. It's as if there was no editor involved, which I know isn't actually true, but there were parts that dragged and some that felt almost repetitive, and they really could have done with some tightening up. The climax of the book was great and exciting, but getting there wasn't as smooth as I thought it could have been. Unfortunately, in my opinion, Shallan was maybe the biggest victim of that. Reading her chapters felt more and more arduous to get through as the book progressed. Shallan has a lot of trauma and baggage from her youth to work through, and I think I get what Sanderson was trying to convey, and I'm sure he did a lot of research about mental illnesses. Over Oathbringer, Shallan is developing several different personalities and starts to lose herself more and more into them to escape from herself and her past. It's obvious that she has to confront and work through her problems, and she does do the first step near the end of the book, but I wish that step would have happened sooner because it had become a bit repetitive. I'm not saying that I need my protagonists without any issues, not at all. As a reader, I just wished for a better flow. And as I just started Rhythm of War, Shallan switches between her personalities like every 5 seconds, and I need some time getting used to that. After all of that, you probably ask yourself, should I really read the Stormlight archives? I may have made this sound like a bigger deal than it actually is, because yes, absolutely, if you love complex world building and high fantasy, that's just different. But keep in mind that you're making quite the commitment. As far as I know, Sanderson has 10 volumes planned, and so far the first 4 books are all over 1,000 pages each. So what I really recommend, if you've never read anything from Brandon Sanderson and you're interested in the Stormlight archives, is to first start with something else from his Cosmere universe. It's not absolutely necessary since the worlds he created for Cosmere are very different, but I found that the Stormlight archives has the most references to his other works compared to other Cosmere set books. So not only will you get those references, but you're also not jumping into a long-running epic that's not finished yet. My first recommendation would be the original Mistborn Trilogy. With 3 books, this series is long enough for some more complex developments in the story, but also not too long to overwhelm. The setting of the books feels a bit proto-steampunk to me. The second trilogy, that's set in the same world, but takes place sometime after the events of the first, is more steampunk-ish. The premise of Mistborn is basically this. What if the villain won and ruled long enough that no one remembers what the world was like before? And of course, we've got a bunch of heroes who plan to topple the regime as the world is pretty miserable and becoming more and more inhospitable. Oh, and in this world's magic system, digesting metals, in small, not too unhealthy amounts, grants you different abilities. If you prefer something shorter, consider reading Warbreaker. I believe he has a sequel to that one planned, but as of right now, it is a standalone novel and can be read as such. Our protagonists are 2 sisters who also happen to be princesses. The younger is sent out to marry the god king of a rival kingdom, although sending the older would have been the correct thing to do. Said older sister travels after the younger in disguise, trying to right a wrong, but also to save her unprepared sister. As one can expect, nothing works out as smoothly as imagined, and maybe the younger princess wasn't as bad of a choice as a bride after all. If I were to compare Warbreaker and Mistborn, then I'd say that the world of Warbreaker feels almost the opposite of Mistborn. Whereas the world of Mistborn is literally grey and dark, because everything is covered in a layer of ash that rains down constantly, Warbreaker is full of color with a magic system strongly linked to color and breath. Both have powerful, almost godlike rulers. However, the setups and the conclusions are quite different. So, those are my recommendations if you want to check out Stormlight archives and you're still not ready to commit, or if you want to learn more about the Cosmere universe beforehand. Read all the other books as well as the short stories later if you're still interested. You know, I have a feeling that the Stormlight archives might be the culmination of Sanderson's Cosmere works because, apart from some short stories, these books make it most clear that all those different worlds are connected without explicitly spelling it out. At least as of now. I think I'll end it here. I hope you enjoyed watching me paint Shallan and my mini introduction into the Cosmere universe. If you did, leave a like, a comment or subscribe. That would make me very happy. Until next time, bye!